Frank and Jessie, a couple well past their golden anniversary, set off on an Alaskan cruise. In Ketchikan, they accidentally meet an old fisherman, a man who's clearly not quite from this world, who tells stories, some funny, some a little creepy, and then suddenly says the exact date of their wedding, a date they've never told anyone. Frank jumped off the ship's gangway first, as if there were a secret prize for speed waiting on the Ketchikan pier. Jessie, as usual, lagged a couple steps behind to double-check her purse clasp and adjust her bright scarf. She always liked to be just a little dressier than the local seagulls. The morning air was so rich it felt like its own dish, a mix of sea salt, fish, old boards, and something tangy like their first trip to Atlantic City, only without the noise and glitter. "Well, Jessie, look, these fish are just like my Aunt May. If they don't move, they could pass for a rug," Frank joked, eyeing the fishtails and heads hanging on display. "Maybe we should buy something for lunch, just to have something to talk about for the rest of the cruise." Jessie smiled, knowing Frank always comes alive at markets like these, just like he does at old car shows. She walked beside him, breathing in the air with that special thrill you only get right before an unexpected joy. Deep down, she had a tiny hope. Maybe something amazing will happen today. What if? Though, honestly, surprises come less often with age than the bills for meds. The dock was buzzing with life. Tourists with cameras, local fishermen with coffee cups, and old men who always looked like they'd just beaten the ocean, no matter the weather. One of them stood off to the side, leaning on the railing, wiry, with a beard white as snow and eyes the color of icy water. He wore a battered cap and a waterproof jacket that must have remembered the Kennedy years. He was humming to himself, and when he spotted Frank and Jessie, he smiled in a way that gave Jessie a tickle in her chest, like seeing a friend you haven't met in 20 years. "Good morning, travelers," he croaked cheerfully. "Seeking adventure, fishy or otherwise. You're in luck today. I'm an old fisherman, and I've got exactly 3 stories and 1 free bench. If you promise not to laugh at my cap, I'll tell you how I once caught such a secret in this bay that I still don't know what to do with it." Frank smirked and glanced at his wife. "Look, Jessie, even the fish in his net are smiling wider than I did in our golden anniversary photos." Jessie felt that familiar thrill, a warm wave rolling through her whole body. She waved to the fisherman. "Deal, Captain. We're ready for stories. Just don't scare us, or Frank won't be able to eat fish, and I'll have to listen to his complaints all cruise long." They sat next to the fisherman on a wooden bench that creaked suspiciously, as if it, too, was ready to share a story or two. The fisherman leaned forward, playfully putting his hand to his brow like he was scanning for danger on the horizon, and announced loudly, "All right, listen up. Like the time I mistook my boot for a flounder, and it turned out to be my luckiest catch ever." Jessie laughed. Frank threw up his hands theatrically, and deep down, they both felt that rare sensation when you just know the day is about to turn into a real adventure. The fisherman nodded, squinting slyly. "And that, my friends, is only the first of 3 stories that'll change the way you see Ketchikan." The old fisherman leaned back on the bench, staring at the smooth water where a few raindrops left brief traces, as if someone were writing invisible letters right on the surface. He started telling his first tale, drawing his listeners into a sleepy, warm current of memories. "I was about 20 and much more stubborn than I am now," he began, scratching his stubble. "One night in August, I went out late to fish for flounder. Suddenly the engine died, and I was stuck in the middle of the fog. No stars, no moon, just this voice calling my name. I looked around, no one in sight. I decided if I made it home, I'd thank my luck for the rest of my life and always bow to the first fish I caught. And just as I thought that, my oar hit something solid. Turns out, my grandfather's boat had gotten stuck in this exact spot 20 years earlier, and he'd heard a voice in the fog, too." Frank snorted, feeling for his old fish knife in his pocket as if making sure it was still there, and whispered to Jessie, "Listen, If my dad had caught as many fish as this guy's granddad, we'd have been put in charge of the canned goods for the whole state of Ohio." Jessie laughed, but she could feel there was something magnetic about the story. It wasn't just another fish tale. It was that kind of coincidence that seems like a joke all your life, until you meet your own voice in the fog. The fisherman, noticing their interest, paused, twirled an old net around his finger, as if reading fate between the knots. "You know, folks, sometimes it seems like meetings happen for a reason. Just yesterday, I saw a couple by the dock, arguing over who should buy the ferry tickets. And would you believe it? A minute later, they're hugging. Turns out they both recognized an old song from 1968 in Seattle. These things happen more often than you think." Frank snorted and glanced at Jessie. "See, honey, if you'd sung me 'Stand By Me' back in '68, maybe I'd have learned to dance. But no, I had to wait 20 years before you'd even say yes." Jessie rolled her eyes, but her heart felt a little warmer. She suddenly noticed the fisherman watching them closely, with a gentle smile that seemed to hide a whole world of stories. For a second his look changed. Then the familiar good-natured mischief and twinkle in his eyes returned. In that moment, Jessie realized she didn't want to leave. It was so cozy to sit on that bench, listening to how other lives intertwined with theirs, like waves running along the same line. "You know, let's stay a little longer," she suggested, turning to her husband. "I have a feeling our captain here has a story that could outdo all your fish tales, Frank." Frank pretended to be offended, but was actually already scanning the stands for a fish to try for dinner. The fisherman laughed, eyes sparkling, and began to prepare his second story, while Frank and Jessie settled in, knowing the day was bound to bring something unusual, even if it was just another chance encounter. The fisherman adjusted his cap, glanced at the clouds, as if checking whether the local mists were eavesdropping, and began slowly. "There was a story in my life about a certain special date. Sometimes you think it's just an ordinary day. Maybe the fish are lazier than usual. Then, suddenly, that day turns into one after which nothing is ever the same. I was just a young guy then. That day I won my first serious regatta, and in the evening I met the woman who became my wife. And since then, well, you know how it goes. Some dates just slip from your memory, and others stick so hard you couldn't scrape them off with a knife." Jessie listened without blinking, afraid to miss a word. She realized she wasn't just hearing a story, but was actually reliving her own wedding day. The simple white bouquet, the tiny city hall, Frank's smile, still unmistakable after all these years. There really are days that push everything else aside and become your inner lighthouses. Frank snorted, but the bravado in his voice was suddenly gone. He felt less and less like making jokes. There was something in the fisherman's words that didn't fit into regular logic. What are the chances? But it's these very coincidences that warm your heart on long winter nights, if you're lucky enough to live to see your grandkids. The fisherman squinted slyly, looked them both over, and then said, "But sometimes an important date isn't just a mark on a calendar. It's like a password that pops up at the most unexpected moment. Like with a friend of mine, on his anniversary, his car broke down right at the entrance to Ketchikan, and his wife found the earring she lost at their wedding 20 years ago. There's a date for you." Frank couldn't help himself, lightened the mood, and nudged Jessie with his elbow. "All right, Captain, if you can guess our wedding date, I'll go buy a lottery ticket right now, and Jessie will finally be a winner, at least somewhere outside our household arguments." Jessie laughed and playfully smacked Frank on the shoulder, but inside she felt uneasy, like before an important test, when you know something inevitable is about to happen. The fisherman leaned in closer, looked first at Frank, then at Jessie, and then, face unchanged, calmly said, "June 23rd, '69, am I right?" Silence hung between them like a fishing net, pulled tight. Even the seagulls seemed to hush for a second. Frank dropped his knife right on the dock, and Jessie felt the world spin for a moment, as if someone invisible had tossed their lives into the air. The moment the old fisherman casually said their wedding date, Jessie felt like she was inside a black and white photo from an old family album. There was a roar in her ears, or maybe that was just her pulse, and in her mind flashed that June day. Frank, squinting at the sun, holding her bouquet. Friends laughing as they tossed confetti in the empty city hall, and the two of them, totally giddy, eating ice cream on the steps. So many years had passed, yet the memory was as alive as fresh sea air, and she could swear, even salty on her tongue. Inside, Jessie felt a strange mix: delight, surprise, a touch of fear, and an aching gratitude. She instinctively reached for her anchor pendant. That's what she always did when she needed to regain her balance. Maybe it's just a coincidence, she thought. Or maybe it really is something more. Frank, trying to get things back to normal, laughed loudly and slapped his knee so hard that a seagull jumped nearby. "Come on, Captain, you can't do that. Are you some kind of mind reader, or do you have a deal with City Hall? Jessie, don't tell him our insurance number, or he'll start predicting other things." But behind the laughter was a very different feeling. Frank suddenly realized his old battle-worn heart was skipping a beat, for real. All these years he'd learned to brush things off with irony, to laugh, even when others wouldn't. But this moment, it felt like the universe itself winked at them, like it was saying, "You two aren't together by accident. This is something real." For a second, there was a pause between him and Jessie. She looked at her husband, and he looked back, both a little stunned, neither quite believing what had just happened. It made you want to laugh, or cry, or call your kids and say, "Seriously, isn't this amazing?" "Frank," Jessie said quietly, squeezing his hand, "you're sure you never told anyone?" "Jessie, I swear, if I could keep secrets as well as I keep a grip on a fishtail, we'd be millionaires in Hawaii by now." The fisherman, seeing their confusion, smiled mysteriously, his eyes suddenly softer than the waves on the pier at sunset. He rested his hand on his net and nodded gently. "You know, strange things happen in this world. The most important thing is to hold on to each other and never stop believing in little miracles. Sometimes all you have to do is look around, and you'll see your happiness has been waiting on shore, not out at sea." Jessie suddenly felt, yes, that's exactly right. Even if you can't explain it, maybe you don't have to. She looked at Frank, and this time there was no embarrassment or fear, just a gentle, grateful feeling for this strange, magical moment. And somewhere inside, a new thought was already forming: to tell this story to their grandkids, so they'd believe that miracles can happen on old wooden benches, not just in fairy tales. Jessie walked along the pier a little slower than usual, and every step felt a bit unreal, like someone had secretly stirred a spoonful of magic into her tea. She tried to sort out her feelings, but her thoughts were tangled like a fishing net after a storm. "He couldn't have known our wedding date, could he? Maybe he overheard it in line. Or is it just a coincidence, like hearing your favorite song on the radio after 30 years? But inside, she felt a strange excitement. Not fear, but a kind of flutter, like before you jump into water. Even her anchor pendant seemed heavier, as if it now hid a tiny secret. Frank walked right beside her, occasionally resting his hand on her back, supposedly for her support, but really so he wouldn't get lost himself. He snuck glances at his wife and suddenly remembered when he wasn't an old grump in a baseball cap, but a young guy who could spend all night on the pier, wondering if she'd show up for their date. There was something of that youthful thrill now. The world seemed unpredictable, anything was possible, and a new chapter was waiting ahead. "Jessie, what do you think? Is he a spy, or just Ketchikan's local Copperfield in retirement?" Frank tried to joke, but his voice sounded truly alive, almost boyish. "Frank, if it's magic, let him guess where I hid your socks next time." Jessie smiled, but caught herself not wanting to explain what had happened, as if saying it out loud would make the magic vanish. They wandered through Ketchikan's quiet streets for a long time, looking at shops with carved fish, listening to the locals argue about the weather, and stopping at every statue as if searching for a sign to explain it all. But no explanation came, just a light laugh and a feeling that the years between them had shrunk and the air between them had grown. Jessie squeezed Frank's arm. "You know what? Let's not try to figure it out. Let's just call it a gift from Ketchikan. Not every miracle needs an instruction manual." Frank nodded and suddenly felt not just Jessie's husband, but that same young guy who, for her, could have believed in a talking whale or a mermaid by the pier. He looked out at the evening port, where the lights danced on the water and the cruise ship looked like a toy city. "What matters, Jessie, is that adventures can happen at any age if we're together, even if it's just a date on the wind or a new recipe for fish stew that we'll mess up anyway." They laughed, and the anxiety faded away, as if the sea breeze had picked it up and carried it past the horizon. Their steps felt lighter again, like people who aren't afraid to be amazed, no matter how many years they've lived. Against the evening port, glowing gold, Frank and Jessie realized, it doesn't matter if you can explain a miracle. If life gives you a mystery, just be glad it happened to you. Walking back from their stroll, Frank and Jessie stopped by the pier where their cruise friends Susan and her husband George were chatting near the souvenir shop. Susan waved and immediately started interrogating them. "Well, newlyweds, how's Ketchikan? Found any adventures yet? Don't tell me you skipped the smoked salmon or they won't let you back on board." Frank smirked, glanced at Jessie, and confessed, "We tried the salmon, sure, but we also sat down with an old fisherman and heard things you wouldn't believe. Jessie, tell them how he guessed our wedding date right out of thin air." Susan and George exchanged glances. "A fisherman? What fisherman? We've been cruising here for 3 years. Never seen anyone like that. All the fishermen are either out on boats or in the bar. Trust us." Jessie tried to describe the old man. Cap, beard, a voice like a foghorn. But Susan just shrugged. No, you two must be seeing Ketchikan's magic for yourselves. Or maybe your oatmeal was the wrong texture at breakfast." That's when Jessie wanted to check something. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through the photos she'd snapped at the dock. Frank by the fish stalls, Jessie with her coffee, the sunset, the ships. And then, in the photo on that same bench, there they were. Frank and Jessie sitting, but next to them, nothing. The spot where the fisherman had been was just empty, as if no one had ever been there at all. "Well, that's something," Jessie muttered. "I know I took a picture when he was sitting right there." Frank whistled, more amazed than scared. "If he doesn't show up in the photos, I guess we got ourselves a private complimentary ghost. Just imagine if he'd caught us some fish for dinner too. Now that would be priceless." Jessie felt her earlier anxiety turn to excitement, almost like childhood, when you found a secret path in the woods and had no idea where it might lead. So there's your explanation. No explanation at all. Just the sense that something a little out of the ordinary really had happened to them. They headed back to the ship, arguing and laughing as if they shared a secret that only people who believe in little miracles can know. "Frank," Jessie said, "I think this day deserves a toast and the best dessert on the ship. If Ketchikan's ghosts are wishing us happy anniversary, we'd be fools not to celebrate." "Agreed," Frank nodded. "But if the restaurant serves us fish with a beard, I swear I'm done with cider forever." Laughing, they stepped on board, and suddenly, the evening seemed even brighter than usual. Dinner in their favorite restaurant on the ship began, as always, with jokes and studying the menu, though tonight, beneath their familiar glances, there was a quiet anticipation and even a hint of nervousness. Jessie poured tea carefully, while Frank, for the 100th time, tried to guess what would surprise them tonight. Their waiter Thomas was used to these two by now, but tonight there was a kind of electricity at their table. Everything tingled inside, as if something strange was about to happen again. Soon Thomas arrived with dessert, a big plate of lemon pie, topped with strawberries, and a small card that the waiter handed over with a conspiratorial grin. "This is from our chef, for the two most cheerful guests this evening. Hope you enjoy." Jessie took the card, opened it, and read aloud, "Happiness to those who believe in miracles." Talk about perfect timing, she chuckled softly, keeping her eyes on Frank. They exchanged a glance, and in that silent moment, there was everything: confusion, joy, a bit of nervousness, and even a touch of worry. Frank snorted and raised his eyebrows so high they nearly disappeared under his cap. "Well, Jessie, now I've got only two theories. Either you've been secretly casting spells in our cabin, or Alaska's just lost its mind with all these tricks. If I find a golden fish on my pillow tomorrow morning, we're splitting my pension 50-50. Jessie couldn't hold back her laughter, and Thomas, catching their looks, joined in. "You know, magic isn't officially on the menu here, but sometimes miracles happen, especially for those willing to share their dessert." At that moment, the evening fog crept up outside the window, the ship gently vibrated, and it felt as if their whole world had shrunk to that little table with 2 cups of tea and one big secret. Laughter danced in both their eyes, and there was a spark between Frank and Jessie, the same kind of electricity you feel on a first date. Jessie looked at her husband and thought, if there's real magic in life, it's always right nearby. You just have to look a little closer. And Frank realized he was already wondering what other miracles this night might bring. The ship moved slowly into the fog, and in their hearts bloomed a fresh, almost youthful love again, no matter how many years had passed since that day. Evening wrapped the ship in soft light and the clink of glasses in the bar, while outside the panoramic windows, Ketchikan city lights shimmered like a string of lights stretched between 2 eras. Jessie sat closer to the window and quietly pulled up her chair. She wanted to watch the distant streetlights dissolve into the fog, as if the day had vanished, and only this endless night, full of mysteries and new promises, remained. Frank poured himself more tea, dropping a rusk in the cup, a habit from his youth, for the taste of life, as he always said. "You know, Jessie, who would have thought," he began thoughtfully, "that in our 70s we'd be sitting here, reminiscing about our own wedding and wondering whether that fisherman was a man, a ghost, or just a kind magician. If I'd known this was possible, I'd have stopped pretending to be a grown-up at 20. Jessie smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. There was something childlike and shamelessly tender in the gesture, as if they'd only just met. "You know, Frank, our whole life is made of stories like this, isn't it? You think everything's already known, and then, bam, some bearded fisherman comes along and throws out your whole recipe for happiness. Maybe we don't need to explain anything. Let's just let it be a miracle. We don't have to understand everything." Frank hugged her, squeezing her a little tighter than usual. In his arms was the peace Jessie had loved for years, and at the same time, a new, ticklish excitement. "I promise, Jessie, no more arguing with fate, and no more talking about fishermen, unless one shows up at breakfast with a new date to announce." "Just not your credit card due date, please," Jessie giggled. "Let it be something beautiful, although, if it's destiny, who are we to argue?" They laughed and hugged, trading jokes and memories. It seemed a little brighter around them, and even the air on the ship felt softer, like after a summer rain. Inside, both of them felt that fragile, invisible sense, like life had become wide open again, just like in youth, when anything could happen tomorrow or even on an ordinary bench. Before bed, Jessie lingered by the window, looked at Frank's reflection in the glass, and realized this was the real renewal. Not just another date, not just another story, but that moment when you're truly happy to be here and now with the person beside you. And that night, wrapped in their blanket, not thinking about ghosts or old fishermen, Frank and Jessie fell asleep feeling a little younger and a whole lot happier than at the very start of the trip. Morning on the ship started with Frank's usual grumbling about the coffee being too strong and the mysterious prices for pastries at the buffet, but even his regular remarks sounded softer today, as if he was still half dreaming. Jessie, curled up in her chair, watched the sunspots dance across their table and the green hills pass by outside, like someone flipping through an old travel album. Everything felt bright and calm, as if yesterday's strangeness had faded away, making room for a cozy, homely bustle. "Well, Jessie," Frank said, slurping his tea with the same energy he once brought to fishing in his youth, "if that fisherman shows up on the dock tomorrow morning, I swear, the first thing I'll ask him is for a lottery number, or at least a good soup recipe. It's time we got some real benefit from these mystical encounters." Jessie snorted, set her cup down, and tilted her head to look at her husband. Those eyes held a whole life, so many years lived, so many miracles, big and small. She shook her head and, smiling softly, said, "You know, Frank, I think the real miracle is us. Doesn't matter if we've met ghosts, fishermen, or just strange coincidences. The most important thing happened a long time ago, when we chose to be together. That's the real luck." He took her hand, and for a moment the whole ship, with its hundreds of passengers and noisy breakfasts, disappeared for them. It was just the two of them and the morning light. Somewhere in the distance, the ship was lazily turning toward new shores, promising new encounters and fresh stories. But for Frank and Jessie, this small, magical moment lingered in their hearts like the warm afterglow of a strange dream. They both knew, sometimes a miracle is just being together and allowing yourself to be amazed, even when miracles are hiding in the most ordinary day. Sometimes the most wonderful things happen when you least expect them, and it's those moments that make life shine. In every journey, even if it seems everything is already predictable, there's always room for a miracle and new hope. And if you're lucky, someone will remind you how important it is to take care of each other and believe that only good things lie ahead.